Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar with Paul LaBeouf, Vice President, Research and Development at Aperture Education. He is presenting on promoting teacher resilience. As you guys are funneling in, I'm going to go over a few things with you. My name is Emily, so if you have any questions, shoot them into the chat or the Q&A box, which I'll talk about. To start, I would like to mention that technology has been overwhelmed the last few days and few weeks, excuse me. And while we're not expecting any difficulty, if we do have any interruptions, I will record the presentation in full and send out the copy to you as soon as possible. That being said, this webinar is being recorded and everybody will receive a copy at the end of the presentation. If you're having problems seeing the slides, you should first exit the screen view. If you still can't see them, double click on the small box at the top middle of your screen and that should pull up the slide deck. You should also see the three functions at the bottom of your screen. The chat feature can be used to ask questions or share any tech issues you may be having. Why don't we try that out and let us know your name, district or organization, and job title. I see a few of you have already done it, so thanks for getting ahead of me. The Q&A button, this is where you can ask any questions to us. And finally, raise the hand function. This feature can be used if there are any tech issues. If you raise your hand, I'll send you a private chat and we can address any issues. Normally at the end of the presentation, we take a live Q&A. However, we're going to hold off on that today, but please send us any questions in that Q&A box and we'll answer them one-on-one either during or after the webinar. So if we don't get to you, don't worry, we will. And the last piece I have for you today before Paul gets underway is that we do offer professional development certificates for your attendance at this webinar. I'll be sending a link out early next week to guide you through that process. So that's a lot of information, and I know Paul has a lot more for you. So without further ado, here's Paul LaBeouf.
Thank you, Emily. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. You know, I often begin sessions on promoting the resilience of teachers with a short video from Fablevision called Keepers of the Flame. But we did not want to risk overwhelming our bandwidth and have chosen not to show it today. However, we will be providing you with the URL in our post-webinar email. I'm sure many of you have seen the video, but if not, it honors teachers as the nurturers of the flame of learning in children. It describes how, as students encounter adversity and challenges, it is the teachers who keep their flames burning bright. When the video concludes, I typically ask the teachers, who keeps your flame burning bright as you face the endless challenges of being a charismatic, effective teacher? An important question under normal circumstances, an essential one in our current crisis, and the focus of our session today. So let's begin by looking at the educational objectives for this session. So my goal is that 1 hour from now, you will have a deeper understanding of the nature of resilience. You'll be able to apply a practical framework for better understanding your own resilience. And lastly, you'll be able to implement a few select strategies for promoting your resilience. You know, I must admit, I'm feeling particularly self-conscious today presenting this material given the extraordinary challenges that our colleagues are confronting every day in both their personal and professional lives. It seems like hubris to me to think that I may have something to offer that will help us keep those flames burning bright. To be certain, I have no magic bullets, but I am hoping that I might have some helpful buckshot to help us get through the coming weeks and months. So just a little bit, about me. I've been researching resilience for 25 plus years now. I began that work with my colleagues Linda Likens and Susan D'Amico at the Devereux Center for Resilient Children. And then a number of years ago, with the creation of Aperture Education, I came on as the Vice President for Research and Development. During that time, I published quite a few articles and book chapters on resilience, and most importantly, I and my colleagues, Val Shapiro, Jack Naglieri, and Jen Robitaille, have published a number of assessments of behaviors related to resilience in children, ranging from infancy through high school graduation. And those assessments have now been used with millions of children all over the United States and a number of foreign countries. I've also presented pretty widely over the past 25 years on topics including the promotion of resilience in adults, including teachers. But I've got to admit, I am still pretty unnerved by the current situation, which brings us to the first real slide about resilience. This graph is taken from the work of Ann Maston. Ann Maston is one of the leading researchers in resilience over the past 25 years or so, and has really greatly contributed to my understanding of resilience and, of course, people's understanding in the field. And what this graph is showing us, if you look first at the red line, this is the risk gradient for sort of typical people. And really what we're trying to illustrate here is that the more risk factors in your life, you can see that on the horizontal axis at the bottom, the more risk factors you have in your life as a teacher, the less your effectiveness as a teacher. I think that's no great insight there. So you can see with 2, 3, and 4 or 5 factors, the teacher effectiveness declines, and then eventually at about 6, 7, or 8 risk factors, it begins to kind of bottom out. What we're talking about today are the teachers represented by the purple line, whereas Ann Maston would say the resilient educators who are off the gradient. These are our resilient teachers. And the take-home message here, and I think what's really important, is the insight that even resilient individuals and resilient teachers are negatively impacted by risk factors. It's just that they are not impacted as much as people who have less resilience, which we'll talk about in a moment. So that's why Dr. Masson says that they're off the gradient. When people started studying resilience back in the late 50s and into the 60s and 70s, many of them had this concept of resilient people being invulnerable. So there's actually a book even written during that period called The Invulnerable Child. And there was sort of this notion that people were so hardy, so tough, so resilient, that you could pile on the risk factors and it really didn't phase them at all. They would just kind of keep trucking on through whatever it is that they were doing. And we now know that that's not true, that even the most resilient teacher is going to be negatively impacted by the extraordinary risk factors we're facing at the moment. So our effectiveness is going to be negatively impacted, but not as much as it would have been if we didn't have the resources to help us maintain our resilience. Another important thing to note about resilience is it's not absolute. We can't sort people into buckets where some of us are resilient and others of us are not. It's a continuum. And not only is it a continuum, but we can actually move along that continuum, changing day by day. So some days we may prove more resilient than others. And overall, what our goal is today and in general is to raise our overall level of effectiveness and to decrease that variability, especially the variability on the low end. So let me give you a more formal definition of resilience. This is from the New Freedom Commission back in 2003. I'm going to present this and then I'm going to kind of deconstruct this definition a little bit. So let's just begin by looking at it. It says resilience means the personal and community qualities that enable us to rebound from adversity, trauma, tragedy, threats, and other stresses, and to go on with life with a sense of mastery, competence, and hope. And if we look at this a little bit more carefully, we can see that they're talking about rebounding from adversity. And often, you hear people characterize resilience as bouncing back or rebounding from adversity. And there's this notion that sort of when it's all over, we bounce back to where we were before. But as Ann Maston showed us on the previous graph, resilience can also mean that we're maintaining a fairly high level of functioning during the crisis itself. So resilient people persist and they do their jobs and do them well despite the challenges that they're facing. So that's point number one. Point number two is about adversity. So we're rebounding from adversity, trauma, tragedy, threats, and other stresses. I used to point out in resilience trainings that it's very unlikely that any of us would get through our lives without experiencing significant trauma. And I guess moving forward, I'm not going to need to highlight that point. COVID-19 is now a defining part of our collective experience. But the point that's being made here is that to really say that an individual is resilient, they have to be exposed to risk and adversity. Resilience is all about rebounding from that risk and adversity. So if we had not experienced it, then we might have the capacity for resilience. And a lot of the work that I and my colleagues have done over the past quarter of a century has been trying to provide students with the capacity to respond in a resilient way when they face that adversity. But now, it's part of our common experience. So first you have to experience the adversity, and then you have to go on with life with a sense of mastery, competence, and hope. So let's look a little bit more at these different kinds of threats and adversity. The Robert Wood Johnson Foundation in 2014 did a study called The Burden of Stress in America. And in there, they talk about different kinds of stressors. And the first category is major life events. These are the very traumatic, often episodic kinds of things that happen to us. In fact, in this report, they claim that nearly half of all adults have reported a major stressful event in the past year. So these are the biggies, right? These can be things like illness and death, or the death of or illness and disease, the death of a loved one, having problems at work, having major life changes like a divorce. Again, half of us experience those, one or more of those every year. In addition to those major life events, though, we also have hassles. These are the more repetitive, kind of lower grade things, but because of their repetitive nature, they can kind of wear us down and sometimes can take more of a toll on our well-being than those major life events. So Robert Wood Johnson reported that in the last month, half of us felt we just had too many responsibilities. More than half of us were concerned about our finances and work issues. More than a third of us had health concerns. We were concerned about health problems of our family members. And interestingly, nearly a third of us, 28%, listed being unhappy with our appearance as being a monthly hassle for us. And then to make things even worse, we have the daily hassles. So in this report, people said that 48% of them struggled with just all the demands on their schedules. Nearly half of us, and this is before COVID, said that just hearing about government and politicians and watching and listening and reading the news was a major source of stress on a daily basis. Household tasks, commuting to work, remember those days when we used to worry about commuting to work? A third of us found that to be a source of stress in our lives. And 30% of us reported losing something like our keys or our iPhone every day. So we have the major life events, the monthly hassles, the daily hassles, and there's been lots of research around this. Of course, the challenge now is that our current crisis with COVID-19 is really a triple whammy. I mean, it hits all three of those. And so maybe some of the research that we've been looking at for the past 25 years or so may have to be adapted to fit this current kind of complex situation. But despite that, despite all those stressors at all those different levels, teachers continue to meet our expectations. They do their jobs well, and they not only teach, but they're caring for and supporting the students in our schools. That is, they're demonstrating resilience. So what I want to do for the rest of this session is really to talk about how we can promote our own resilience. So how do teachers do this? How, despite all these overwhelming risk factors, do they manage to continue to care for and educate their children as well as take care of their own families? And part of the answer to that is that resilient individuals have the benefit of what we're going to call protective factors in their lives. Alan Kasdan, a well-known clinical child psychologist, defined these protective factors as characteristics, events, or processes that decrease the impact of the risk factor and thereby the likelihood of an adverse outcome. And my colleagues at the Devereux Center for Resilient Children like to use this image of a young child with a big umbrella. So the umbrella is our metaphor for protective factors in this slide. It doesn't necessarily stop the rain, but it does help keep the child dry. So it protects or buffers or shelters the child from the negative impact of the risk factors in their life. And protective factors in our lives can help buffer and protect us from some of the impacts of our current situation and hopefully enable us to have better outcomes than we would have had without those protective factors. So here's kind of another key image, one that we've used for many years. And the notion here is that our outcome of either being resilient or its opposite, vulnerable, is really a result of the interplay or the balance between risk and protective factors in our lives. So on this scale, you can see on the left-hand side, we have risk factors. And we can see that they come in the environment. Risk factors can be present in our families, and they can also be present within ourselves, be personal risk factors. And on the other side of the scale, we have protective factors in the environment, in the family, and in ourselves. If, kind of metaphorically speaking, the protective factors in our lives outweigh the risk factors, that scale is going to tip to the right, and the outcome is going to be a greater sense of resilience for us, a more positive outcome. On the other hand, if the scale gets overwhelmed by risk factors on the left, it'll tip in the opposite direction, which will lead to more negative outcomes and greater vulnerability. So clearly, the way this can work is we can either try to decrease the risk factors on the left, or we can increase the risk factors on the protective factors on the right-hand side of the scale. The bad news sometimes is that the risk factors are not really within our span of control. So when we think about environmental risk factors at the moment, if our medical system is being overwhelmed, of course, there are some things we can do about that, like social distancing, and it's certainly our obligation, responsibility to do that. But that's not going to, it's not going to have an immediate and direct impact on the medical system in our communities. It's going to contribute to it. It's going to flatten the curve. We all have a duty and a responsibility to our communities to engage in social distancing. But as we know, looking at the nightly news, that effect is going to be felt, days and weeks and maybe months later. Similarly, we can have family risk factors at the moment. We can have lots of kids that we need to take care of. We can have a spouse or a partner that maybe has some health issues that's creating some additional risk factors for us. And we can have our own personal risk factors. We might have problems with substance abuse or mental health issues or just poor general health. All those things are risk factors. And as I mentioned a moment ago, they are not under our immediate control often. The good news is that protective factors are more under our control. So when we think about environmental protective factors, we can think about the healthcare professionals in our community. We can think about the first responders. We can think about the individuals that are driving trucks to keep the grocery store shelves stocked. And although they're not under our immediate control, when we get to personal protective factors, you'll see how they are. Similarly, family protective factors. There's nothing more important to a child at the moment than an adult, preferably a parent or a grandparent or maybe an older sibling who loves that child unconditionally. So we have environmental protective factors, family protective factors, and the ones that are really within our control are our personal protective factors, things within ourselves, our own strengths, our own characteristics that can help us cope effectively, or at least more effectively, with the challenges we're facing. And that's really what we're going to focus on in the remainder of this presentation. However, before we get there, I want to just make a couple other points about resilience. First of all, this is malleable, which is a term that psychologists and social workers like to use that means it's changeable. It can be shaped. So protective factors can be added, and I'm going to hopefully give you a couple new ones to add to your repertoire. And they can also be strengthened, the ones that we already have. So this is something that's subject to change and can be learned. The second is that it can change over time, which is really a reason for hope. So we might not feel particularly resilient today, but hopefully we can learn some techniques, we can do some things that will help us feel more in control and more resilient in the coming days and weeks. The third point here has to do with something called quotidian resilience. So Jennifer DeCorsia at Ed Tronick published a paper in 2011 in which I believe they coined this term quotidian resilience. And their key insight was that coping successfully with everyday typical stressors is what builds resilience. So of course, what we're facing far exceeds everyday typical stressors, but their key insight, I think, is still valid. It is the little wins. It's the frequent practice that promotes our resilience. So when we think about building our resilience, we don't have to radically change our lives. We don't have to go out and spend a lot of money on some new thing. What we're going to be talking about today are everyday quotidian things that we can do that can promote our resilience. So in the remainder of this session, I want to highlight four key personal protective factors, and I'm going to talk about 6 simple daily practices that may help us build this quotidian resilience. So let's start by talking about finding meaning in crisis. So the guy pictured here with that really outstanding stash there is Friedrich Nietzsche, who famously said that he who has a why to live for can endure almost anyhow, highlighting, I think, the importance of meaning in helping us cope successfully. So the ability to make meaning out of our experiences of adversity is a key and commonly cited protective factor. Viktor Frankl, who was a Holocaust survivor and author of Man's Search for Meaning, asserted that the greatest task that we face is finding meaning in our lives and experiences. And Frankl believed that there were 3 key sources of meaning. The first was our work. The second source of meaning is our love and caring for other individuals. And the third is finding courage in difficult times. And I think, Frankl's message really could not be more timely. So to help us in finding meaning in our work, I would like to share our first strategy, which is called What Difference Does It Make? This was something that we used to train, and I'm sure my colleagues still do, at the Devereux Center for Resilient Children. And the notion was, at DCRC, or the Center for Resilient Children, we worked with teachers of very young children, so the early care and education providers. And we would ask them to think about what is the most difficult, annoying, mundane, disagreeable part of your day as a teacher, as an early care and education professional. And often they would say, well, it's changing diapers. I'm changing diapers from the moment I get to work to the moment I go home. I'm always washing my hands, and frankly, it's a little tiring after a while. And then we would ask them, okay, so I want you to think about that. I want you to think about changing diapers all day and ask yourself 4 questions. First of all, what difference does that make for your students? So for a young toddler or an infant in an early care and education center, what difference does it make that they have a clean diaper? I think the answer to that's pretty obvious. If you're teaching elementary school students, you might ask yourself more kind of appropriately, what difference does your taking time to prepare good online lessons and deliver them every day make to your students? If you're a teacher who is checking in with your students every day, think about, and you're finding that to be tiring, which of course it is, ask yourself, what difference is that making for your students? Secondly, ask yourself, what difference does that make for their families? What does it mean to that parent at home with 3 or 4 kids to have teachers who are reaching out and making sure that their students are still learning? There was a great thing this morning, I think it was on the Today Show, of a young girl who was struggling in math with her kind of take-home work assignments. And the teacher came to the house, brought a whiteboard, sat on the front stoop with a closed glass door between the 2 of them, and helped the student understand and master the math skill. So what difference do you think that made to that family to see the teacher engaging in that kind of behavior? And how does that then reflect on your school? And lastly, what does it do for you? How does it make you feel about yourself as being a competent, confident, engaged, effective teacher despite everything going on around us? So you might want to keep this in mind when you think about how tiring it gets to score those papers or do those daily or weekly check-ins with your students. Ask yourself, what difference does it make to them? The second area that I want to focus on has to do with keeping perspective. And I'm the parent of a special needs child, and as a parent of a child with special needs, I learned early on the importance of keeping perspective. And one approach that I and many other parents of children with special needs used to find courage in confronting our family situation is called downward comparison. And the notion was that we could find motivation and determination and courage by comparing our circumstances with others and realizing that they have challenges even greater than ours. And when we look at the extraordinary courage of our medical professionals and first responders in the current crisis, I think it can make us feel more inspired to do our part. Of course, we should not be insensitive to the terrible toll that COVID-19 is taking on them, but regardless, their courage and their steadfastness can still serve as an example for us. The complement of downward comparison is gratitude. Comparing our circumstances with others can foster an appreciation of the resources and assets that we do have. And I would like to share two strategies to deepen our sense of gratitude. The first of these I got from the positivepsychology.com website, and it's called the Gratitude Ramble. And the notion here is that, many of us are trying to, at least once a day, get outside, weather permitting, and hopefully go for a walk around our neighborhoods. And that has a number of benefits for us. One, gets us out of the house. Two, gives us a little, private time to reflect on things. Three, it provides some exercise for us and some fresh air. And at the positivepsychology.com website, they also recommend that we use that period, that ramble, as an opportunity to reflect on gratitude. So even if it's just being grateful for having decent weather when we can go outside, and being thankful that this isn't happening in the middle of the winter, being grateful that at least many of us have a pleasant place and a safe place to walk and to get outside. To be grateful that our neighbors are keeping their social distance from us, and yet at the same time being grateful for their being friendly and waving and saying hi as we pass by on opposite sides of the street. So something simple, something quotidian, going back to that slide, that we can do every day is just to try to be a little bit more reflective, a little bit more grateful when we go on those daily walks. Related to that is our second strategy, which is actually kind of one of my favorites, called gratitude on cue. And I think lots of us over the years have made some kind of intention that we're going to be more grateful, and maybe we start a gratitude journal, or perhaps we commit to writing thank you notes to people. And then you go to bed at night and it's like, darn, I forgot to journal today, or I forgot to, write those cards, or whatever the practice was. Somehow we got through the day and didn't think of it. And the notion of gratitude on cue is to pick something in your daily routine that's going to serve as a cue for you to just take a moment and just reflect on what you have to be grateful for. So my practice has been to try to take a moment and consider what I'm grateful for when I turn off a light. Because when you think about it, the last thing that we do when we leave our office, whether it's at the school or now at home, when we leave our home office, one of the last things we do is we turn off the light switch as we leave the room. And that act of turning off the light can then be a cue to us to reflect on what we're grateful for in our work life. So our gratefulness for our colleagues, our gratefulness for the technology that allows us to keep in contact with our students, the gratefulness for, at least for many of us, having a place at home where we can work. Turning off that light, throwing that switch, which is something we do every day, can become kind of a simple reminder. Similarly, the last thing many of us do when we go to bed at night is turn off the lamp on our, the table next to our bed. So similarly, when we turn off the lights and we're lying there in our beds at night, it's a good moment to reflect on the things we're grateful for during that day. And I think once you get into that practice, it can easily become a habit. And frankly, it's a little easier for me than the notion of trying to keep a gratitude journal, as wonderful and as important as they can be. So something, at least in my life, that's a little bit more practical and a little bit easier to do. So that's our second personal protective factor, keeping some sense of perspective. Our third one has to do with personal agency. And Emmy Werner is another researcher. She was a psychologist at the University of California, Davis. Unfortunately, she passed away a few years ago. And Dr. Werner did one of the absolute landmark studies in the study of resilient children. It's sometimes called the Island of Kauai study. And what it's about is in 1955, Emmy Werner and her colleague Ruth Smith were invited by the province, or the territory rather, of Hawaii. It was not yet a state, didn't become a state, I believe, until 1958, but they were invited by the territory of Hawaii to come to Kauai, the Garden Island, and to study the developmental trajectories of all the children born on that island in 1955. And one of the things that Emmy Werner and Ruth Smith did is they measured all the risk factors in these infants' lives. And then they tracked those students for the next 40 or so years. This is a very long-term longitudinal study. And every decade or so, Dr. Werner and Ms. Ruth would write a book summarizing how those students were doing in that decade of their life. So she goes into the island of Kauai. There are about 700 students that were born that year, or 700 children born that year. She measures all the risk factors in their lives, and she divides them into two groups. The first group are the high-risk kids. These are children that had 4 or more significant risk factors in their lives by the time they were 2 years old. So things like the loss of a parent, or a divorce, or becoming homeless, or poverty, major risk factors. 4 or more by the age of 2. And then there were the children that were not high-risk kids, and she started to track them. And what she found was that, as expected, in the high-risk group, about 2/3 of those students did have developmental challenges. They did have problems growing up. So when they got to school, they had problems with attendance, they had problems with learning. As they got a little bit older as adolescents, they had problems making and keeping friends or staying in a committed romantic relationship. As they became adults, some of them had problems with staying in a long-term relationship with a spouse or partner, holding down a job, etc. About 2/3. However, 1/3 of the kids had very positive developmental outcomes, and Emmy Werner described them as children that lived well, loved well, played well, and expected well. And she talked about these as being the children that defied the odds. And I think it was a little unexpected. She couldn't really kind of wrap her head around how these children could manage to have such positive outcomes despite all the risk factors in their lives. And so she really almost changed the focus of her study to try to understand these resilient children. And one of the things that she found was that these resilient children had a much, much higher internal locus of control than the other students or the other children. So there's a standardized measure of locus of control that she used, and the resilient children tended to average 2 standard deviations above the mean for the other kids. So much higher scores. If you're not familiar with the concept or the construct of locus of control, if you have an external locus of control, you feel that you are subject to external factors, that your success or your lack of success is due to things beyond your control, due to things outside of yourself. So if you're a student, if you have an external locus of control, you might say that you didn't do well on a test because your teacher didn't teach the materials well. It had nothing to do with you. It was something external to you. On the other hand, if you have an internal locus of control, then you attribute your success or your failure to your own actions. So a child with an internal locus of control, if they didn't do well on a test, would say, well, I didn't study hard enough. I didn't know the material well enough. And the next time I can do better, which is the key kind of resilient insight there. So these children have much more of a sense of self-efficacy or personal agency or being responsible for how their life is going to turn out. And that's a characteristic that's very common with any resilient individual. So what we need to do to promote our own personal agency is to think about what's within our span of control. What is it that we can influence? And not just what can we influence, but what exactly do we need to do next? What's the next proximal step? So I might be overwhelmed by just the thought of COVID spreading in my community, but I need to think about what can I do to stop that, or at least to do my part to help contribute to flattening that curve. And social distancing is clearly something that's within my span of control. What's the very next thing I can do? In all seriousness, as I'm sitting here doing this webinar, my wife is downstairs sewing fabric face masks for herself and for other members of our community. So what are the things that we can do to take active control over the situations that we're in? And the strategy that I would like to share related to personal agency is called Take 5. It's not the jazz classic by Dave Brubeck. And actually, when I Googled this strategy, Take 5 strategy, what I got was strategies for playing the Take 5 lotto in New York State. And that's not what we're talking about either. This particular strategy, I believe, came from Mark Greenberg. who is the author of the PAS curriculum. And I believe it was shared with me by one of the PAS trainers, Sandy Stewart, a number of years ago. And the notion here is that, often, at least back in the days when we were driving to our schools or driving to our offices, we would drive to work, we'd pull into the parking lot, we'd turn off the engine, grab our cup of coffee and our book bag, and walk into the building and start our day. And what Mark recommends we do is to literally take 5 seconds, just a very brief period of time, and turn off the engine, but sit in our car for a moment and just take a few seconds, take a few deep breaths, and just picture in our head what kind of teacher we want to be today. What do we want to accomplish? What do we want to model for the students that we're going to be interacting with? What kind of peer and colleague do we want to be to our fellow teachers and our administration? And just set a few intentions. Doesn't take more than just 10 seconds, 15 seconds, 5 seconds even, to just think about that. What kind of person do I want to be? What kind of day do I want to have? What do I want to do differently and better today? And then grab the cup of coffee and the book bag and go in and start the day. Again, something easy, something that doesn't take a lot of time, but something that can really be pretty powerful. And then the last topic that I want to talk about is optimism and courage. So, optimism is a critically important protective factor. The belief that things are going to improve and that we can return to a new normal is foundational to every act of coping. So maintaining optimism in trying times, can be difficult, especially given the negativity bias that is inherent in human nature. That is, we do have a predisposition called the negativity bias to fixate and ruminate on the negative. We remember all the bad news stories better than we remember the good news stories. And somebody expressing some concern or some tragedy is going to stick with us more than somebody talking about something positive or some triumph that they had. And this is part of human nature. It's actually called the negativity bias. So given our predisposition to fixate and ruminate on the negative, optimism really requires an act of the will. Because of the importance of optimism, we are going to send each of you a link so that you can download the Optimistic Thinking Educator Guide from Aperture's new product, which is called EdCert. EdCert, of course, is an acronym which stands for Educator, Social, Emotional, Reflection, and Training. And it is a series of it's a tool, it's a resource to help teachers reflect on their own social emotional competence and their own teaching practices and how they reflect those social emotional competencies. In EdCert and in the DESA program, we look at 8 different social emotional competencies. There's an educator guide for each one. So we're going to send you a link so you can download the guide to optimistic thinking. So we hope you're going to find that helpful in promoting your own optimism and being able to teach it more effectively to your students. But in the meantime, I want to share 2 strategies that might be helpful to you. So the first one is called even if. Even if is one of the strategies that accompanies the DESA assessment. And even if was created by and authored by Anne McKay Bryson, who is a very gifted social emotional learning educator and now works as a consultant with the Collaborative for Academic Social and Emotional Learning. And Anne is the primary author of the strategies that accompany the DESA program. You will also be receiving a copy of this strategy in the follow-up email. It's written as a lesson plan for teachers. But in short, it's a very kind of simple and easy way to effectively reframe disappointment and to maintain a more positive and optimistic outlook. And I think it also reinforces our internal locus of control. So the notion or the way it works is, when you're faced with a disappointing situation, something that's just not working out as you thought, rather than just being discouraged and dismayed by those circumstances, Anne would encourage us to say, even if. So even if I can't teach my students in the classroom, I can still reach out to them via video chat. Even if I can't go visit my daughter and son-in-law, because in Pennsylvania we're now under a stay-at-home order, I can still reach out to them via Skype or FaceTime. And as a couple really good examples of even if, there was another touching story on the news, I'm sure many of you saw it. It was on the evening news, I think last night, of a young couple that had intended to go to Paris, and the gentleman was going to propose to his girlfriend on the Champs-Élysées in Paris. Of course, they can't travel to Paris now because of the travel ban. But what this guy did is he took a piece of chalk and he drew a beautiful image of the Eiffel Tower on the side of a building. And then he brought his, soon-to-be fiance there, and he got down on one knee in front of his outline drawing of the Eiffel Tower and proposed to her. Now just think about how memorable that's going to be and what a story that's going to be for them to tell their children. And just a great example of even if we can't go to Paris, I can still draw the Eiffel Tower and make this a memorable occasion. Similarly, if you're wondering why I have this image on the slide here, again, many of you probably have already seen this, but the music students at the Berklee School of Music did a beautiful recording about a week ago of the Burt Bacharach song, What the World Needs Now. And of course, they couldn't do this as an ensemble, at least not in the same room, because they've all been sent back home. So a large number of them, 30 or 40 of them, did it as a virtual orchestra. And we're going to send you the YouTube link or URL for this. If you haven't seen it, take a moment and look at it. And it's just, again, a great example of, even if I can't be with my fellow music students to play as an ensemble, we can do this virtual recording of What the World Needs Now. And just think about the impact and the number of views and the inspiration that that has caused around the world. So even if is a great strategy, again, our goal is to do things that are simple and easy and practical. The last thing that I want to mention as a strategy is to be aware of our family histories. We need to remember that our current crisis is really not unprecedented. Our forebears endured difficult times just as we are now. So my parents lived through the Great Depression and World War II. My grandparents survived the Spanish influenza in 1918. And you might not know this, but actually I looked this up earlier today. The number of individuals at the moment that are infected by COVID-19 around the world is 1 million. We just passed the 1 million mark in the last day or so. The Spanish influenza in 1918 infected 500 million people worldwide and resulted in up to 50 million deaths, including 675,000 in the United States. So I'm not trying to minimize the challenges we have now. I'm certainly not trying to minimize anybody's, trauma and loss during this period. But this is something that our ancestors, our forebears endured and survived. And going back even further in my family history, my ancestors came to the United States in the early 1800s as refugees and survivors of cultural genocide. So the stories of courage and endurance and commitment and survival in our own family histories can inspire us and give us the courage we need now to face the challenge of our generation. In many cases, our ancestors who came here as immigrants or refugees or in bondage were paragons of resilience. And if we know their stories, we can gather strength from their example. And if not, now would probably be a good time to learn. So as concluding thoughts here, Rebecca Solnit, in her book, A Paradise Built in Hell, documents how, contrary to common beliefs, disasters typically bring out the very best in people and in communities. So rather than looting or rioting or hoarding Purell, the far more typical response is to demonstrate empathy and concern for our neighbors and even strangers, as we have seen so often in our own community's responses to COVID-19. Moreover, after the crisis is past and life has returned to normal, many individuals reported to Rebecca Solnit that the feeling they had of community and solidarity and belonging and contribution during the crisis gave their experience of the crisis meaning and purpose and joy. And hence the name of her book, A Paradise Built in Hell. So as we noted earlier in the hour, as the current crisis presents a new and unique constellation of risk factors, and our experiences may be quite different than those described by Rebecca Solnit. Nevertheless, we need to keep firmly in our mind that the study of resilience teaches us that risk is not destiny. And if we continue to strive to manage our risk factors and build our protective factors through everyday actions and interactions, we will optimize our odds of demonstrating resilience and continuing to be the teachers that are, in the words of Emmy Werner, competent, confident, and caring. So all of us at Aperture wish you the very best. Please let us know how we can continue to support you and your students, and thank you for joining us this afternoon. Emily, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you so much, Paul. I'm not sure how I can follow that up, and I apologize if my voice cracks because that was so touching, and I truly appreciate it, and I get to work with you, so I'm very lucky. As a reminder to everyone who's joined us, we are not doing the live Q&A, but we are responding to all questions one-on-one. Please feel free to also reply to the follow-up email if you have any questions. You will have a recording in your inbox in about 24 hours, along with a slide deck and links for all the videos Paul discussed. He did talk about a lot of them today, so they'll be in there. The PD certificate link will go out early next week as well. Thank you all so much for spending time with us today. We really appreciate it, and we appreciate each one of you. So thank you so much, and have a wonderful rest of your day.